Yeah, I do want to say I think you're doing something really important here. I think it may not be obvious to everyone, but there in fact is an awful lot to talk about and a lot to learn. In fact, we collectively don't know anything like what we ought to know about processing mentoring. And I'd like to just make four comments from my own perspective, from my own personal experience about this matter. Let me just say something about myself before I start. I was a non-traditional student. I went to undergraduate school in my late 20s. My parents had never set foot on a college campus, and to say I was clueless is probably an understatement. I mean, I not only didn't know, I had no clue what it meant to go to college. I mean, it was a souped-up high school for all I knew. And it was a complete shock to me to find out. As I became a senior, I had no idea what it was to talk about going to graduate school. The point I want to make about this, and that relates back to this mentoring discussion today, and this is my first point, is that an awful lot of what happens to students who aren't privileged students, first-generation students, anybody that isn't a privileged student, is that an awful lot of what happens and keeps them going is just serendipity. It's just accident. And a lot of what this today is about is figuring out how we can get past the accidental advancement of students and somehow touch their lives in much more constructive ways. So that's my point number one. I think one way to think about what we're doing here is to get past the accidental furthering of students' interests and systematize what we do to move students along. First-generation students, whether they're minority students or not, experience an awful lot of this same kind of cluelessness, and I think we can all learn a lot from. My guess is that a number of you in this room share my experience, and probably has something to do with why you're here. I mean, a lot of us are in this business because it's a calling, and the kind of things you're here to talk about today are what makes the difference between this being a job and being a calling. And it has a lot to do with our experiences. So that's my first point. The second point is related closely, and that is that a lot of what we want to do is a sort of a pale approximation. And I mean pale with a capital P, but a pale approximation providing the kinds of support that the most privileged students have. I mean, it's sometimes we slip into this, from my perspective, kind of bizarre notion that somehow we're providing special assistance to students. The fact is, we're providing only the palest of versions of the kind of support that privileged students have that go to good private schools and go on to Swarthmore or Amherst or Stanford. I mean, we can't possibly provide the kind of support that they get from their families and the kinds of environments that they are in for most of their lives. We can't even come close. So we're just doing a pale approach to that kind of support. That's very important. I think that's a very important perspective. If we do our jobs optimally, we still will only be covering a little bit of the ground that most of our students lack. I had a friend when I was at the University of Nebraska who used to had an approach to talking about privilege for his students, and I thought it was really kind of neat. It put things in a perspective. He would talk to his students first day of class, and he'd say, "How many of you went to Exeter?" Chose. And they, what in the world is that? Well, he'd explain to them that if this was a class at Swarthmore, most of them would have been there. And that's privilege, and they don't have it. And I think that's a very important perspective for us to think about in our schools. And for the populations that you're going to be talking about today, this is true today. My third point relates to this, and I'm going to say this very briefly. I recommend to you a book that's going to appear this spring by a guy named Rob Ibarra. It's going to be published by the University of Wisconsin Press. And Rob looks at Latino students across the country. Says some really, how many of you know the book? Any of you know the book or know Rob? Rob makes some really, I think he's just right on. But the main burden of the book is this, that so many of our programs are focused on students, and as if students were the problem. And an awful lot of the problems we have are institutional problems. The culture of higher ed. Maybe the most dramatic example is this. The population of students Rob talks about, Latino students, he says, come from what he calls high context cultures. Cultures where human relationships mean everything. Everything in life gets its definition, its meaning from human relationships. And in American higher education, we live in a culture that is driven by an ideology of meritocracy and individual achievement that absolutely systematically strips human relationships out of everything we do. We systematically strip human relationships out of higher education. Now, that's a terrible thing to do. I mean, especially for somebody that comes from, as Rob calls it, a high context culture. And I think this is just a really good example of the complexity of the issues we face and how we need to be thinking about the culture of higher ed and thinking about the extent to which we're the problem. That we're the problem. That we create environments that are fundamentally hostile to student achievement and student success and student satisfaction. So that's my third point. And the fourth one is this. We can get so involved in thinking about support and nurturing students and equity and teaching content and providing opportunities that we forget about what in some ways is the most important, which is the excitement of the enterprise. My brother-in-law is a very successful German physicist. Germany is a place that doesn't have a lot of trouble getting people into technical fields. I remember at our visiting one day a few years ago at our place and picking up a piece that was directed at students to attract them into science and engineering. Hey, I read this thing. He said, "My God, who's this thing for?" He said, "So he gave this thing out in Germany. Nobody'd read it." He says, "You know, the way you attract students is you give them the excitement of science, the excitement of research. You have them read novels about it, things like that." Now, that's not a necessary condition. I mean, it's not a sufficient condition, of course, for turning out good scientists, but it probably is awful close to being a necessary condition for really good science. We need to remember that the excitement of the enterprise is something we have to get. This isn't just hard work. It's an exciting, rewarding, and wonderful enterprise for all that. You got to keep that in mind. So those are the four things I wanted to say. I think you're doing something really important. It's very complex for the sort of reasons that I've tried to allude to, and wish you well for a really good and profitable day. Thanks for coming.
Quickly, what is the name of the book, or how do you spell the guy's
His name is Robert Ibarra, I-B-A-R-R-A, and he's a vice provost at Wisconsin-Madison, and the name of the book is Beyond Affirmative Action. And it should be out sometime this spring from Wisconsin Press. Thanks.